Hello and welcome, my name is Racho, and today we will be talking about Yareli. If you watched my tier list video, I mentioned that I had, since March of last year, come up with many builds for Yareli, and I never made a video on any single one of them because they're all bad. Not because they were necessarily like bad builds, like they worked, they did fine, but they were simply just better on other Warframes or fundamentally didn't work at all because of flaws within Yareli's kit. But I finally actually came up with a build for Yareli that is good enough to showcase. Whether or not it can just be better on a different Warframe, we'll debate about later on in the video. But before we get too far ahead into that, we're going to talk about Yareli's abilities, and I am going to outline some of the issues with Yareli's abilities, as Yareli is commonly known as one of the worst Warframes in the entire game. However, she also has a bit of a cult following, and there are a lot of people that stand by her saying that she's actually pretty good. And I'm kind of going to talk about her abilities and talk about why that is not the case, but not in a mean way. We're going to talk about her critically and just plain and simple. We're not going to break it down or anything. We're just going to say exactly how abilities work and why some of them work in a way that is quite unappealing. Anyway, let's get into it. First of all, her passive. Her passive will give her a 200% additive crit chance buff for only her secondary, as long as she has been moving for at least 1.5 seconds. An additive buff meaning it's additive with mods, so you're using whatever the critical delay variation for secondary weapons is, which also gives 200% crit chance. Together they'd make a 400% crit chance buff combined. My issue with this passive is, while it sounds really good, is it's very limiting. There are many Warframes with the same passive. You have Nyx, Zephyr, Frost, Shadow 9, there are, and probably at least Stynax as well. So that the whole idea of having a passive that gives you crit chance isn't a rare thing. Many Warframes have this passive. Yareli is the only one that limits it to a single weapon type. Most of them use both primary or secondary weapons like Zephyr or Shadow 9, and some can even use melee weapons. Frost even allows you to use all three of your weapons and gives you a 200% crit damage buff as well, which is significantly better. Though, to be fair, Frost is an augment, so you don't get it for free. And there's also like 1,000 other Warframe abilities that also buff crit chance, some even in the Helminth, that might not be passives, but a lot of them also buff more than just secondaries. You do, in fact, Yareli is only one of 3 that I can think of crit chance buff abilities that only affect one weapon type. The other ones being Wrathful Advance, which is a significantly better buff because it scales off strength, and also is an absolute buff, making it much better. And also Varuna's buff, which also gives you a crit damage buff and also full slashes proc, both only which work on melees, but both are significantly better than Yareli's anyway. So that's kind of my issue with her passive, because it locks you into a secondary, doesn't give you a massive crit chance buff like Wrathful Advance or a bunch of other useful things like Varuna's buff. Also, crit chance buffs are not a rare thing in this game. There's like 1,000 of them now. They're almost as common as armor strips. Okay, moving on to her first ability. Her first ability is called Sea Snares. She will fire out these water bubbles, which will completely immobilize enemies and make them 100% immune, vulnerable to all sources of damage. This is actually generally a really good ability. I have nothing bad to say about the ability. It is very similar to Nej's ability, and unfortunately, unlike Nej's second, it doesn't increase the drop chance of energy and health orbs, but that's fine. It does offer more crowd control than Nej's ability does, so has something better and something worse in it. Overall, it's actually a really good ability. Yareli's second ability is called Merylina. Merylina will have Yareli summon her exalted K-Drive, which you will then ride upon. While on the K-Drive, you lose all your typical Warframe controls. Instead, you play with K-Drive controls. And if you're familiar with K-Drives, you know that K-Drives have terrible controls. And that's normally in open world settings where you have a lot of space. Most of the tile sets in this game are very clearly not designed to be used with a K-Drive. The K-Drive is completely unmoddable, even though it is an exalted, kind of more similar to Titania's Arqueen form, I suppose, but it is customizable, so you can fashion frame it. While on the K-Drive itself has infinite duration, but instead has a health bar. It has a 4-second period of vulnerability when it is first spawned, and during this period, all damage it absorbs will be added to its health. Normally, abilities like this multiply the damage it absorbs and then adds it to health. This one doesn't seem to do that. It also doesn't scale off armor like a lot of other abilities similar to this, like Nezha's third ability. Additionally, while you're on the K drive, you are also immune to status effects, and you have a 90% damage redirection. This means that 90% of the damage that Yareli takes will be instead redirected to Marelina. However, the ability doesn't come without its major flaws, and when I say major flaws, I'm not talking about the fact that you're on a K drive, which in itself is kind of a flaw itself because it's just annoying. As while on Marelina, you cannot activate any Helminth ability whatsoever, which is a gigantic flaw and is build breaking for basically every build, but you can also only use a secondary weapon, which isn't as much of an issue. You kind of want to use your secondary weapon anyway for Yareli because most of the stats and buffs are directed towards secondary use, but if you wanted to use your primary or melee weapon with her, you no longer can. You can only use your secondary weapon while on Marelina. Especially, this is a massive issue if you run out of ammo with your secondary while on Marelina, and you can't use your melee or primary to fix it. Or if you're using something like the Lieutenant Glaxon with its augment for the energy drops, you would have to deactivate the ability to use the Lieutenant Glaxon, which gets rid of your damage reduction while doing that. So there are massive flaws in this ability and the way it's designed that are very hard to overlook. The ability does, however, have two augments. The first augment is called Marelina Guardian or something like that, I believe. What it does is it lets you heal Marelina by killing enemies that are affected by Sneeze Snare, and it heals Marelina by 20% of the enemy's health. This is actually a very good effect because Marelina, unlike other abilities like this, like Nezha's Wooden Halo or Iron Skin, is actually quite squishy, and even those abilities aren't even that tanky anyway. So Marelina actually dies really easily, so this health healing effect is almost a must-have. Furthermore, the augment also gives you a 200% reload speed and fire rate buff to your secondaries when you do heal Marelina, which is actually an awesome buff. Like, that is a really, really good buff and is a very powerful buff you can give. However, you have to remember that to use this buff, you also can't use any Helminth abilities. She does, however, have a second augment that makes it so Marelina will, instead of you riding on Marelina, it will kind of follow you around as a companion. You still gain the status immunity and the 90% damage redirection that you normally get, and Marelina will either run around activating sneeze stares passively every 2 seconds, scaling off efficiency. So the more efficiency you have, the faster it will do it, which is awesome. It makes it so you can use your other weapons. You can use your melee and primary while still benefiting from the status immunity and damage reduction, and you also get passive C snares, and you can use your Helminth ability, except using this augment prevents you from using the other augment. You can't use both at the same time. So to use this ability, you need to use Loyal Marelina. It is a mandatory mod because without it, you can't use Helminths, which is build breaking, and using Loyal Marelina prevents you from using the other augment that is almost mandatory because not only does it give actually really, really good buffs, but it also heals Marelina, which is really needed. Once again, massive design flaw there. Yareli's third ability is called Aquablades, and it does nothing. What it does is it summons these Aquablades that rotate around Yareli, and enemies that are caught within range, it does literally the tiniest amount of slash damage. It does apply the slash status effect, but it does the tiniest amount of slash damage. It staggers enemies, which is cool, but most of the time enemies will be dead before they even get close to you anyway, because you kill things so fast in this game anyway. So yeah, the ability straight up does nothing. It does have an augment, however, that allows you to recast the ability to throw out one of your Aquablades at an enemy, for literally no reason whatsoever, because the ability does no damage. Her fourth ability is called Riptide, and it's actually a very good grouping ability, except it's not. In fact, it's the worst grouping ability in the game. Casting ability will group enemies within a 5-meter radius, which is tiny for grouping abilities, for the first 2 seconds of the ability. The radius of the ability will the radius of the grouping will lower over those 2 seconds until it's completely gone. Then the ability will remain for an additional 8 seconds, so 10 seconds total, and for these 8 seconds, the ability does nothing. It does damage enemies, but it does literally no damage to speak of. Like, it's barely any damage whatsoever. And while the ability is still continuing, yes, the enemies will be grouped within inside of it for that 8 seconds, but it will not group additional enemies into it, and you can't recast the ability. See, watch this. I cast the ability, and if I try to cast it again, what it will do is it will detonate the original one. When the ability deactivates, or when you manually detonate it, it will, instead of actually pushing the enemies into a nice little pile like most other grouping abilities do. It will instead ragdoll them, making them explode, completely ruining the functionality of grouping. So in summary, you have a grouping ability that lasts for 10 seconds that only groups for the first 5 seconds of its activation, has a terrible radius of 5 meters, which is half than pretty much most other grouping abilities in the game, doesn't group enemies for the remaining 8 seconds of the ability while preventing you from recasting the ability without needing to first deactivate it, making you needed to cast it twice just to be able to group enemies again. And when you do deactivate it, it makes enemies explode, ragdolling them, making them no longer grouped. Once again, massive design flaw. So let's talk about this build. Basically, I put Evade, Sado 9's Helminth ability on her. That's pretty much it. That it does 90% of the heavy lifting in this build. I simply just paired it with Dual Toxicist, which is a secondary weapon, therefore it does benefit from the 200% crit chance she gets from her passive. So we are getting some extra synergy with her kit there. And Dual Toxicist is also really good with things like Evade because in its incarnate form, its bullets will ricochet up to 1 time, and the ricochets will automatically aim for headshots. They aren't necessarily guaranteed headshots, but it does headshot very consistently. It basically gives you auto headshots, making it so you can have 100% uptime on Evade without ever needing to actually aim for headshots. Though you will still need to aim for headshots to actually charge this incarnate form, obviously. Dual Toxicist is basically just a ridiculously powerful weapon, and Evade gives you invisibility, which is a very broken form of survivability in this game. But you are getting benefits from playing Yareli with this build, I'm not gonna lie, and it is actually kind of nice. We are using the Loyal Marilena Augment, which will not only give us that 90% damage reduction and status immunity without needing to ride a K-Drive, but it will also give us passive C-snares, so we don't need to cast it ourselves. And with the C-snares being casted, that also means that we get that 100% damage vulnerability, which does scale strength. So we are making enemies weaker to our damage, which is a multiplicative damage buff. We also get the crit chance from her passive, and we're invisible while doing it, and we're playing with a very, very broken, powerful weapon. So it's actually quite a good setup. My one issue with the setup is that it just works better on Sado 9, because not only does Sado 9 not need to Helminth on his third ability because he just has it by default, the duration of the third ability is significantly better on Sado 9, which gives you more downtime when you're not killing enemies. And also you can, because you already have Evade, you can just also Helminth on other damage buffing Helminths like Zartos Whisper or something. And also you can really just put this same setup on literally any Warframe. Like I could put Evade on a Mirage and then I can get the 200% final damage buff from Eclipse plus the extra damage from my first ability, and it's basically the same setup. Yeah, I'm not getting the crit chance or the damage vulnerability from the first, but I'm getting different damage buffs that might actually even prove to be better anyway. So it's not like a standout build that works specifically on Yareli, but it does work well with Yareli, and because you're playing with Loyal Marilena and the C-snares, it does add that extra bit of flavor that is unique specifically to Yareli, because it will add that crowd control and other elements like that. So it does have a different enough playstyle to it that it is like unique enough to Yareli that it isn't just a situation where I could do this literal exact same build on a different Warframe. It would be similar, but it would be different in its ways, which is why I felt confident enough making an actual video on this build. Okay, so the actual Yareli build. So Evade, it doesn't just make you invisible, it also gives you heals over time when you kill an enemy, which makes it worth extremely well of Combat Discipline and Arcane Avenger setups. Combat Discipline will deal damage to us whenever we kill an enemy, which actually will also heal allies, giving us some support. Which will allow us to basically always have Arcane Avenger activated. It makes it a very consistent trigger for Arcane Avenger, and we don't have to worry about dying from the damage we take from Combat Discipline because Evade will heal us. So it works out a perfect cycle. We get the extra damage crit chance from Arcane Avenger and the healing from Evade so we don't die. Works very well. We are using Arcane Compulsor as well, obviously. At max rank, this will give us increased 30% ability strength and a 3 times final critical damage multiplier, increasing our damage further, as this setup with Arcane Avenger does red crit most of the time. So we'll definitely be making use of that extra crit multiplier. I only have a rank 1 one, unfortunately, but this works very well in this setup because it simply just gets triggered whenever you're invisible, and as long as we're getting headshots with Evade, we have basically 100% uptime with invisibility. Besides that, the build honestly doesn't need a lot. I simply just opted for duration and strength. Strength to increase the amount of damage vulnerability we're getting from C-snares. I get a 317%. And then duration, because duration does increase Evade's duration, obviously, and really that's about it. But yeah, we are using Transient Fortitude and Umbral Vitality, Umbral Intensify, sorry. and Augur Secrets for the strength. And then we're using Prime Con, Augur Message, and Nearest Hatred for duration. I would recommend using Constitution instead of Nearest Hatred because it gives you more duration. I honestly just didn't want to form a Yareli again because I'm not going to play her that much, so I didn't really justify the extra former. So I would recommend forming her if you are really keen on playing this build to put on Constitution, as it will be better, but otherwise Nearest Hatred works fine. And then we do have Loyal Marylina, obviously, and Primed Flow. We don't have to worry about any survivability because we are invisible, and we also don't really have to worry about any energy economy because Yareli has a very high base energy to start with, so we get a ton of energy with Primed Flow, and this is a weapon platform build, and we don't really actually ever need to cast abilities ever. We basically just need to cast Marylina once in a blue moon when it dies. Since we're invisible, Marylina also isn't really taking that much damage either, so it stays active for a long time, which also fixes one of the issues it has. And we never really have to recast Evade ever anyway because it should have infinite uptime. You can cast your first ability if you want to for that extra spreading of your first, but I personally rely entirely on Loyal Marylina to activate the first ability for me, so I'm not really actually casting my abilities at all when I play this build. So next up we have the Dual Toxicist build. We are using Secondary Deadhead. Like I said, the weapon basically automatically targets for headshots, so not only does it make this really easy to trigger, but also gives it that headshot multiplier. We are going for a multi-shot build, even though you might think Pistol Acuity will work really well on it because the extra crit chance and the extra weak spot damage. While that will result in more single target damage, more multi-shot means the Incarnate form is easier to charge, and it also means that you get more AoE, as it means more bullets will be ricocheted to new enemies. So it will overall do more damage with a crowd because it'll just be hitting more enemies. We are using Galvanized Crosshair, which on headshots will give us 120% crit chance buff whenever we're aiming, and on headshot kills it will give us an additional 40%, which stacks up to 5 times, also while we're aiming, and both buffs last for 12 seconds. Like I said, Dual Tox basically auto aims and auto gets headshots for us, which makes this work very well on it, as it is a much bigger crit chance buff than other crit chance mods. Prime Tiger Cracker for the crit damage, Galvanized Shot obviously for the status chance and the Gun CO effect. Then we have Lethal Torrent for more fire rate and multi-shot. Expel Orokin for the faction damage. Obviously you would change this to whatever faction you're going up against. And this is a raw damage build, so I'm going for viral against faction, but you would change it to whatever faction you're going against. So Corrosive, Grenier, Toxic or Magnetic against Corpus, and so on and so on. For the companion, you can run whatever you want. There's not necessarily a specific setup that this build works well with. I will just say, however, that Evade will also make your companion invisible, and Sentinels cannot attack enemies when they're invisible, but these companions can. I went for the Panzer Profiler for this reason, because it will also be spreading a viral status effect with Momentous Symbiosis, which will further increase the damage I do, so I get some viral priming as well from it, which is very nice. And I can't use a Sentinel to prime either, so Panzer Profiler definitely acts as the best primer in this way. We also have Viral Quills for its unique effect too, so even when it does go down, it still won't not Martyr. Viral Quills is ability. Martyr Symbiosis, sorry, gives you the health gate, which we won't use in this build, but I use it for other setups. Viral Quills is the ability that spreads the viral status effect. And Panzer Devolution is the effect I was talking about, that when it does go down, it still spreads viral for us, and also its respawn timer is only 30 seconds instead. Tenon Bond isn't useful for this build. Again, I use it for other builds. Tenacious Bond, however, will give us even more crit damage. Pack Leader, again, you should change this to Medi Pet Kit because we're not using a melee weapon, so this will be better for its healing. Hunter Recovery is for the so it can actually heal us. Link Vitality is for its own survivability, and Fetch is a must-have mod. And Synth Deconstruct is also just extra utility, giving us that extra health of drops. For the claws, we are using Bite to increase its crit chance above 50% for Tenacious Bond, and then besides that we use Swipe for the additional strikes, extra electricity damage and status chance. We have the extra base damage and slash. This is basically Gun CO, Condition Overload, but for Beast Companions. Bell Arena will force proc 4 impact procs on enemies, which through Magnetic Strike will be converted to Magnetic, which gives us increased damage to Overguard and shields, which gives us additional priming. Bloodthirsty allows the companion to heal itself, and Protective Posture will apply 4 puncture procs on whenever it hits enemies, which also gives us some additional priming for Condition Overload, and it also makes enemies it also gives us a crit chance buff against enemies, and also makes enemies damage output weaker, giving us some additional survivability as well. For the utility weapons, run whatever you want. I would just recommend using a rifle for Amalgam Serration for the extra sprint speed, and also Pretos for sprint speed and sprint speed plus slide, and also parkour velocity through its 2nd and 4th evolution. And then for the focus school, again, you can run whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. Zeneric for the extra additional energy economy. Vazarin for some actually useful grouping and extra survivability. Matarai for the armor strip and Yunaru for the armor strip and Matarai for the casting speed, extra damage, power strength, stuff like that. Naramon isn't useful because it's not a melee build, so you don't need to use Naramon. Anyway, that is the build. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got a fun, new, useful Yareli build out of it. And if you like this video, please give me a like and subscribe. Leave a comment about anything you want. You can give me recommendations for other Warframes you'd like to see me make builds on if you wish. And also go check out some of my other content if you I might have a video already out for Warframe that you're interested in. And until next time, bye bye.